Success. All right, we're going to give everyone a few more minutes to trickle in. We're still waiting for Lois. So.
I saw someone by that name raise their hand briefly.
Is she in there?
Let's see.
Oh, there she is.
Okay.
Hi, it was sort of funny. I could see you all, but you couldn't see me. Good morning, everyone.
Oh, thank you, Joe.
Yeah, so I came back. I left and came back. Gonna move my plant.
All right. So now that we have all the panelists, I think we will get started. And so welcome, everyone. Here is our first panel on records and archives in times of crisis, responding to climate change. I'm going to go through a brief agenda. We are going to start with a land acknowledgement, and then we'll have some introductions. Then we'll go through some logistics. We'll talk about our upcoming panels, and then we will dive into the Q&A, both with prepared questions, and then we will have the opportunity for audience members to submit their own questions. So I will introduce myself first. My name is Sarah Ainsworth, and I am a co-coordinator at the ACA at UBC.
All right. Hi, everybody. My name is Natalie. I am the other co-coordinator for the ACA UBC. So just to start out, we want to start out doing a land acknowledgement, because although many of us are in different locations right now, we just really want to take a few moments and think about the physical spaces that we inhabit. And especially as we prepare for a discussion about climate change, we really need to reflect on the land that we're on, how we got here, and how we've treated it. The land that shelters and cares for us and allows us to access these really privileged academic spaces here as UBC students has been stewarded and cared for by Indigenous ancestors for millennia. So before we go on, we would like to acknowledge that where we live and learn is situated on the traditional and ancestral territory that was stolen from the Hunkaminam-speaking Musqueam people. The Musqueam people have been present in what is now Greater Vancouver for thousands of years, and they're still here practicing their traditions and cultures despite the devastating and ongoing impacts of colonization, residential schools, and forced assimilation. To this day, they remain stalwart land defenders who use their voices and resources to bring attention to environmental issues and take legal action against those who choose to cause further harm. Individuals like Audrey Siegel, for instance, have continuously dedicated themselves to climate activism and protests, despite the increased risk they face from law enforcement. For us as UBC's School of Information students, Musqueam people have been incredibly generous with their time and knowledge for the years. And so by engaging in discussions like the one we're having today, we really hope to honor their efforts and continue their mission of protecting the land that protects us. So we would like to suggest the audience members do some research on the land they live on as well. One way you can do to get started with that is by visiting nativeland.ca. One of our executives, Natalie, is going to drop a link to that in the chat. And for those of you that are aware of your locations and traditional territories, if you want to share that in the chat, we encourage you to do that. And to get started, if everybody wants to just do a brief introduction of themselves, I'd love to learn, make sure I'm pronouncing everyone's names right. So I figured if we go alphabetically, Hilda, if you could go first.
It's always been like that. I'm always the first. Hi, everybody. Thank you for the invitation. My name is Hilda Teresa Ayala Gonzalez. I am a recent graduate of the University of British Columbia in 2016. I have a degree also in library science from the University of Puerto Rico. I am currently the director of the archives and the National Library in Puerto Rico. Is that enough?
That is perfect. Thank you. Lois?
Hi, thank you, and good morning, everyone. I'm here on the traditional ancestral and ceded territory of the Tsleil-Waututh, Squamish, and Musqueam peoples, and I've lived here much of my life. I'm a first and second generation settler, and I refer to myself as she and her. And I'm an environmentalist, a feminist, and a socialist, and an archivist. So I'm here today, I guess I'm been working in archives and records for about 15 years. And I'm an adjunct and sessional instructor at UBC, and also just working on my PhD dissertation, which is on retention and disposition in digital environments. And through that, a component of that is on sustainability. And so participated in the upcoming special issue on records in the Anthropocene, which is in the Records Management Journal, next issue. And the paper is called Sometimes Green is the Outcome. So thanks very much for inviting me to participate. I'm interested in listening and learning as well.
Thank you, Lois. Bruce, if you could go next.
Johanna J. Bruce Lause, Watsi Lause, West Moby Dots SJ, Musqueam Dunnan, Nane Kaz J. Hi, everyone. Thank you for inviting me today. My name is Bruce Muir. My traditional name is Watsi, which means caribou. I'm the Senior Environmental Planner with West Moby First Nations, which is located, roughly speaking, in northeastern British Columbia.
Thank you. Rebecca?
Tansey, Rebecca Sinclair, I am Rebecca Sinclair. I'm from Barrenlands First Nation, Brochet, Manitoba, and Little Saskatchewan First Nation. I am currently in Winnipeg on Treaty 1 territory. I am happy to be here today. I am the program coordinator for Lake Winnipeg Indigenous Collective. I'm also releasing a joint report on decolonizing climate policy in Canada with Indigenous Climate Action and Dr. Jen Goby. Yeah, it's a little bit about me. I also want to put a disclaimer that I have some teenagers home today and a little dog who just loves to have attention right when I'm in the middle of a panel presentation. So hopefully that background noise doesn't come too much into this today. Thank you. I go say.
Thanks, Rebecca. I'm sure hopefully by now we're all used to fun background interruptions. And last but not least, Eira.
Hi everyone, my name is Eira Tansey. I live and work in Cincinnati, and the Cincinnati area and the land that the University of Cincinnati is on, where I work, is on the native homeland of the indigenous Algonquian speaking tribes, including the Delaware, Miami, and Shawnee tribes. I am the digital archivist and records manager at the University of Cincinnati, and Cincinnati is where I grew up. And prior to my current job. I did live and work in New Orleans for several years at Tulane University. So I'm really excited to be here with you today. And I thank you for inviting me.
All right, thank you all so much for introducing yourselves, and thank you all for being here today. I know engagement feels very hard these days, and every time you think you've hit the wall, I feel like you find a way to hit another one sometimes, but we really appreciate that you guys have all been here today to give us your time and your knowledge. And I also want to thank all of the executives at the ACA UBC. You know, we're all finishing grad school and working multiple jobs and taking care of our families and finding time to do all of this. And I just really appreciate how hard everyone has been working to make this happen. So thank you all as well. And thank you to the ACA professional chapter for setting this up for us, getting the Zoom going, and providing us with some financial support so we can get this off the ground. It's just been, everyone's been very helpful since we've been trying to get this started, and we appreciate everyone's efforts. This is also our first time running a Zoom webinar and hosting a virtual event. Usually we have a big thing in person, but we're really excited about the virtual event because it really opens up abilities of participations, time zones, all that. So we're really glad to be here. You know, we've all been living this way for a while now, virtually, and, you know, so we expect some technical glitches, awkward stops and starts. So, you know, we just request that everyone be kind to each other and patient. And, you know, not that I don't expect that from everybody, but just a reminder. Yeah, so for panelists, just a little rundown of the Q&A versus the chat. The chat, if you guys want to use that to share information and talk back and forth, and then the Q&A, if you have questions, if you could direct them to the Q&A section, because that way they can be upvoted, resolved as they're answered. And that's it's a little easier to corral the questions that you have. And again, before we get started, you may have seen in our registration that we talked in lieu of charging. Usually there's a price for student tickets, but we don't want to charge students for things. But we did say in lieu of student tickets, if you have a few dollars to spare, we were recommending that people donate to Indigenous Climate Action. So we will drop a link in the chat to that just in case. And yeah, so we also, this is our first panel in our 2021 discussion series on responding to climate change. We have another one coming up on April 30th on documenting injustice as it unfolds. And our third and final one will be on May 28th, and that will be on allyship in the archives. So we will also put a link in the chat to our registration pages for those if you're interested. So if we want to go ahead and get started, we do have a list of prepared questions that we sent to everybody. It was a little lengthy, but we figured we'd rather have too many questions than not enough and run into awkward pauses. So these are all questions that our student executives have come up with, and we've also sourced some from our Twitter. And our first one, we figured try to start pretty generally. What are the most prominent ways that you see climate change affecting your individual practice? And whoever wants to start, feel free.
Someone's got to start.
I could start, but Bruce, it looked like you were about to.
No, I was about to say ladies first. So.
All right. Well, I'll try to tackle it. And this was, I have to say, this was the longest answer I prepared for the questions. So I hope that's okay. I just might take a couple minutes to fully explain this. So when I was thinking about this question, and I'm glad that Lois already broke the ice. Lois, you're not the only socialist in the room, because I ended up talking a lot about capitalism for this question. And so when we think about climate change and the impact on archives, I think what we have to talk about is a really important issue, which is, and I'm speaking from a US context, right? I want to make that really clear, which is, I don't know enough about the Canadian political economy in order to weigh in on that, but I, have grown up in the United States, so I feel comfortable providing commentary on the United States. So, the US, United States society is organized around a capitalist economy and a capitalist political system. And in the last 4 decades, a lot of this has been characterized by neoliberalism. And so capitalism and neoliberalism are these words that often get used a lot, and depends on, sometimes people use different definitions. And so capitalism, just as I define it, is an economic system in which private interests own the means of production and call the shots on the distribution of profits. So capitalism doesn't give its workers a meaningful say in their compensation or working experience. And its worst tendencies can be blunted by unions and regulation, but ultimately it's a system designed to maximize profit. And neoliberalism is a set of political choices that is often found in capitalist economies. And neoliberalism tends to emphasize forms of government that allow capitalism to maximize its profits through methods like deregulation, union busting, and privatization of the commons, right? So this is when we hear about things like Britain's National Health Services or the United States Postal Service being threatened with privatization, that is neoliberalism in action. And so the reason that I'm talking about this in the context of how climate change impacts archives is because the very existence of archives and libraries to begin with does not easily fit into the logic of capitalism and neoliberalism. So what types of profits do archives and libraries generate? Almost none, right? There are some prestige institutions that have gift shops, right? The New York Public Library has a really great online gift shop with great jigsaw puzzles you can buy. But that's not enough to sustain a cultural heritage institution. And so if neoliberalism's logic says to privatize as many public services as possible, well, then that begs the question, who are the paying customers for archives? And I don't think, historians or genealogists or many of the people who use cultural heritage institutions are, deep-pocketed customers. And so this is how you get to archives that are characterized as a luxury, or they're nice to have, but they are not seen by people in power as critical to the operations of a functional society. And so this whole setup is to say that I am really worried about the potential for climate change to accelerate the forms of austerity that have sabotaged archival work for 40 years. If you look at the staffing levels of US cultural heritage institutions, a lot of them have lost enormous numbers of staff in the last few decades, or the staffing, like this is true of the National Archives, really has been the same since the 1980s, even though the population of the United States has grown a lot. So to wrap up this line of thinking, when I think about how is climate change going to impact my practice as an archivist, I think, well, will coastal states with understaffed archives be willing to put more money to the state archives if they're struggling to pay out insurance claims after a hurricane? Will universities that no longer get as much funding from the states be willing to replace a leaky archives building when maybe they would rather put their money into a program that brings in higher tuition revenue? Will a historical society that is dependent on private donations in an area experiencing population loss due to natural disasters, will they be able to keep a conservation staff member on site in order to deal with mold outbreaks? So this is, I think the big elephant in the room we have to talk about, which is that we know that the problems that are already there with how it impacts our practice as archivists, these are problems that have existed for decades, and they are likely to get a lot worse with the acceleration of climate change. So I'll stop there for now.
Maybe I can jump a bit. Thank you, Eira, for your talk, because it's really important what you've stated. When I received the questions, well, let me give some background also. I live in Puerto Rico. So Puerto Rico is an island that is in the Caribbean, and we have been over 10 years in a very deep economical crisis. Puerto Rico is bankrupt, and Puerto Rico is a territory, or we are a colony of the United States, right? So that's very stated. In 2017, we were hit by a hurricane where it goes by the name Maria. And before Maria, we had Irma. So when I was reading these questions about climate change, it really struck me that I really don't think about climate change because we live in so many crises, like a crisis after another, and everything that you just stated is my reality. I am in charge of an institution that only has 11 employees, National Library and National Archive, 11 employees. How do I have or prepare for an emergency where I can barely provide services, right? When they're cutting the money, where they cut the money from is from the cultural institutions. In a hurricane, the cultural institutions are not a priority, lives are a priority. So whenever an emergency and a climate change will occur, for example, Puerto Rico is an island, so most of our coast will disappear. So one of the institutions that will disappear will be the archive, because we are in the flooding zone, and we are in a tsunami area. But we know that we are not going to be a priority for rescuing the people, or I mean, rescuing the documents versus rescuing the people that are in that area. We know that we're not going to be mobilized by it because cultural institutions are at the very low priority in terms of what's important for the governments, right? So I think it's also very important what you say. So thank you for that.
I think I'll jump in next. I think it's important to note that I am not an archivist in the Western sense. My very practice is environment and the land. So I see climate change affecting, I think I would like to do a disclaimer too, that for the land, I am speaking of my relatives. So climate change is impacting my relatives in a significant way. The land has essentially spoken. When we talk about lives as being a priority, the land is a priority, and if they are speaking through those significant climate change effects like tsunamis and hurricanes. And I think it's really important and vital that we listen to that and listen to their words. I think it's also important to note that while I'm not an archivist, oral history is a practice of that, and our language, being Indigenous, is really important to that history and to that narrative, and how we talk about the land and how we combat climate change and how we keep that practice alive and give it merit. I think in the current climate that we have right now, we are incentivizing capitalism at the most basic sense, that a lot of disproportionately impacted communities are in crisis management as opposed to mitigation measures. And that I know for federal government in Canada that this is given way more weight as opposed to those really important mitigation measures that Indigenous people would be able to speak to through our own oral histories. So it's in my practice, it's affecting everything, and it's affecting the most important relatives in my life and in your lives, and it's a relative that we all share. You go, Seth.
For me in my community, our primary archive is the land. So when you talk about archives, that's kind of the start and the end for us. And when challenges with respect to that, it's the fear of uncertainty rash decisions and ineffective approaches. It's the inability of government to have a long-term focus. It's like walking into a restaurant and today's special. That's the approach that's always been used, and it's just this very, very short-term. Some people might refer to it as a band-aid, but it's more of just today's special. The pace of development, it's the race. The race to exploit just doesn't stop. It just keeps going. So as a result of that, we're losing geographic information and medical information faster than we can keep up. For example, there's one ecological community where we are, let's say this right, Ujo Mitse Tse U, where it grows. It's an important lung medicine. It's on the north side of Wonchi, which is commonly called the Peace River. And the Site C Dam is going to destroy all that. So there's a big piece of that knowledge that's gone. That's the one, it's a rare plant in our territory. Wonchi also links us back to the last big changes in the environment. Danaza, we have oral history of hunting mammoth. An old elder who I never met, he was gone years before, he told stories of ice miles thick and walking on what we see mountain ridges today, and there's miles of thick ice. So their oral history of the Danaza, we went through that last large climate change. And Wonchi, that's how we tell stories of mammoth and these other animals. Sometimes even dinosaur tracks, I shouldn't say sometimes, they'll also link us back to that history. So things like that and changes in the land and the climate really affect our ability to teach, to revisit things, to learn from our past, to do things today. Another one is Gus. It's a plant, a Gus. When Gus opens up, that's when the moose are fat. But Gus doesn't open up if it's not wet. So if we have periods of these, even these micro little droughts, right, Gus, it doesn't do that. Then the moose aren't fat. That one plant is an indicator for environmental health. And that links us right back to our moose and to our harvest. So climate change is a direct change on how and when we do things and where we go to do things. So in terms of practice, we have development pressures that are exceeding our ability to just keep up with gathering and protecting that geographic knowledge and keeping the land intact.
Thanks, everyone. I'm not going to say too much. I just really feel people were very articulate. And so I think that the only thing I would maybe say is that the other thing I noticed is that it's about our work and our practice, but it's also about our lives. And so, you know, I'm kind of very practical and tend to focus on what to do sometimes. And so for me, a lot of that is about looking at my own life and thinking about my footprint and what to do about that, and then taking that to work. So that's probably where I'll come in a few times. Thanks.
Thank you all for sharing. I think there's a lot that, you know, we say this event is for students, and I think there's a lot of perspectives that we don't necessarily always get in the classroom. And it's just really, really appreciated that you guys are sharing that knowledge with us so we can sort of prepare ourselves as we start to go out and enter the profession. Following from that first question, what should we be doing in terms of disaster preparedness and making changes, considering both long-term goals and short-term mitigation methods?
Okay, maybe I'll go. And here I make a little list. So for me, I know that there are, when we talk about mitigation, there's many things that we can do in our day-to-day activities. And I guess we learn this on our everyday work. Don't leave the boxes on the floor, don't have things close to a window or to a door. If you're gonna go for a long period of time, don't leave records unattended on a table. So those are things that are part of mitigation. It's like the little tasks that you can do, like have your alarms ready. But for me, if I don't know which are my risks, I cannot plan or mitigate properly, because I need to understand which are my vulnerabilities, which are the vulnerabilities of my building, of my resources, in order to actually make informed decisions on what to attend first. So for me, the first thing related to mitigation is know which are your risks and put them in order into which one will cause the more damage, or that will be the more difficult to recover from. And then you go by lowering your priorities, and then you attend them. But also, the second thing that I believe is the most important one in terms of mitigation is to know your collection and know what you have and know where they are. Because when a disaster comes, how are you gonna account for something that you don't know where it was, or that you didn't even know that you had in your collection? So the inventory of the resources is also very important for mitigation. And even though I know this is short term, I'm gonna move it to long term, and is disaster preparedness and response plans. And the reason why I put it in the long term, because we can develop a document, but until that document is workable, until that document is put into practice many times, until you have a team that can understand, that are trained, that go to drills, that document is a simple document that is gonna live on a drawer. So it takes a lot of time for you to develop a very good disaster preparedness and response plan.
I think I can go next. I think identifying what you have access to and what the risks are really important, like Hilda had said. And just resonating that for Indigenous people, oral history is our response plan, and accessing that knowledge is getting harder and harder, especially with COVID. And our biggest mitigation efforts are knowledge transfer, and making sure that those opportunities are available for knowledge transfer, because our youth are our future, and our youth will hold those oral histories into the next generation. But identifying what is our biggest risk and being able to combat it based on that. I'll go there.
When I read this question, what popped in my head right away is, what do you do when your bathtub is your repository? And what I mean by that is, an actual bathtub has a 20-year-old study with all the paper documents are physically sitting in a bathtub, and a 40-year-old log cabin, and the water was never turned off. We run into situations all the time where we have knowledge. When you talk about short-term risk, there's information that is not even, people have it. It's something put somewhere. And it's, in this one case, it was in a bathtub. That study, we didn't have any other copies of it. It was the first study we did. A lot of the elders have passed since then. So we run into these situations, and other people in other communities probably have similar stories to the bathtub. We've found one study that was sitting in a maintenance shed, and half of it became the home of a pack rat. So in terms of short term, we're not even prepared before we even get to climate change issues. Just our current problems. When we start thinking about climate change, well, then it's about identifying what's likely to be lost or degraded, and degraded both physically and spiritually. A lot of times people just look at the physical capturing of things and archiving that, when there's a spiritual part to it, and that's usually just left out. And arguably that's the most important part. Some of that's even our place names. Like when I pulled up a map, and as a geographer, we look at place names a lot, and in there's a lot of very vulgar language, both ethnic slurs and sexual slurs that describe the Canadian geography. Those are legal names of places in Canada. So we talk about short term, we can't even get to some of the climate change stuff just because of that. So when we talk about long term, I can't even grasp that just yet. I'm still stuck in preparing for dealing with climate change right now, because just the way the funding works in communities, right? The federal government doesn't recognize libraries aren't really necessary. Librarians aren't necessary. Archivists aren't necessary in communities. Well, how the heck are we supposed to maintain information when the very thing, the systems and everything that we need, and the people in particular to do it, just aren't funded? We do have 3 systems we're working on building and improving. One is our spatial information. The other one is the kind of the internal and external relations, like the consultation type stuff. And a third system is more of a cultural museum. One of my biggest agitations is we have all this history about our treaty, and the people don't have any access to it. None. And that's not good. It boggles my mind we've had this problem for so long. And that is slowly changing when we have our third system, where we can provide that access to people. So those are the things that we're working on just to get ready for this other big problem that's already happening to us.
And Bruce, I'd like to add on to that too, is that there's a hierarchy of what's important to keep. And I think that you spoke to that a little bit, but just to clarify that there is a hierarchy of whose knowledge is more important in this history of archival work, and what histories we need to be making important to safeguard. And Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous ways of knowing has rarely ever been one of those.
One thing I would also want to draw some attention to is that there's, I think it's also really difficult to get our arms around a lot of thinking about the, in my experience and in the professional circles I circulate in, people are very institutional focused. And so it's sort of like, what's happening at my institution? And there's often not, there is not the level of, multi-institutional coordination that we really need. And there are notable exceptions to that. But a lot of my work has focused on, and I'll throw a bunch of links in the chat. A lot of my work has focused on identifying like how many archives exist in different locations, and how do we, can we say things like, this is how many archives are at risk of sea level rise, right? And just sort of getting that kind of quantitative data is shockingly difficult. And so a lot of my work over the last few years has been trying to rectify some of that. And I do think that there are some really interesting cooperative disaster response models that I personally think just need to be replicated everywhere and at all scales. And I'll throw those links in the chat as well. One of them is the New Orleans Preservation Coalition, which was started a few years ago. And that is a way to sort of also recognize that there are a lot of cultural heritage organizations, especially in cities like New Orleans, that don't have a lot of professional people on staff, and yet oftentimes they are the keepers of a particular neighborhood's knowledge, right? But they might not have, you know, a professional conservationist on staff. And so it's a way to sort of ensure that there are community resources to access. There's also something called CoStep, which is a model that has been implemented at least in Massachusetts and maybe Arizona. And that is that in the States, there are often state level emergency management officials. And a lot of times there are, you know, if a disaster happens, there's like a flood or a hurricane or a tornado, a lot of times areas will be physically cordoned off and only certain emergency management or emergency response personnel can get in there during a disaster. And so a lot of these sort of developing emergency preparedness network models are based on the idea of, before a disaster, bringing together emergency management officials and cultural heritage leaders, so that when a disaster occurs, you know, whoever's like holding, you know, the cordon line, like knows to let in the archivists to go, you know, check out the damage to the site. And so that idea of sort of developing those relationships before a disaster hits is really important. And I think it was said earlier, you know, there's like, we know that disaster planning is a thing that is done, but, you know, having a plan and then actually being able to execute it, like the difference is resources and staffing to do it, right? And so that's I think a huge challenge. So I'll throw some of these links to the organizations I've mentioned in the chat.
I can mention too that your work and your work and Ben's work was also an inspiration for us in Puerto Rico, because after the hurricane, we didn't have data of how many archives, libraries, and other cultural institutions were located, but we wanted to help. There were many institutions that were reaching out to see what we needed, but we didn't have a way to gather data. So I'm in the local archivist organization. So we began to reach out to other local organizations to share the data. And I have to say that it's been almost 4 years, but last year we finally had a dummy of an example of how we would look all these location data on a map. So we are a little bit more prepared now. And we also developed so we call it the Cultural Alliance for Emergencies. So in Puerto Rico, we've been working with last year with this alliance. We are all a graduate from something called HEART, is Heritage Emergency Training, that is developed by HEMTEF and Smithsonian. And every year they provide a training to get together professionals from cultural institutions and emergency response manager to sit down and talk and see how they can work out together. Because as you mentioned, when there is an emergency, and it happened in Puerto Rico, institutions were locked out. So librarians couldn't go in the building, archivists couldn't go in the building, and everything was getting moldy because nobody knew what to do. So this was very shocking for everybody. And they're trying to build those relationships so they understand that we can work together, because obviously the emergency management people, their role is to salvage the people, but we have our role to salvage and work with the collections. So we can divide the work, you know, and get better faster if we work together.
Yeah, I think about this a lot. So, you know, I think that associations, so we have a federal association for archives and for records management, and also provincial. And these are really important groups that that are us as professionals. Students get involved. ACA UBC, for example, is putting on this talk. But I think they've been a kind of underperforming. Like, We are just now forming a special interest section on land and the environment and indigeneity in the Canadian Archival Association. So it's just starting. It's currently underway. Claire Williams is leading that. There's been quite a bit of work done at the provincial level. Our own AABC has been very good and has a lot of resources, and has been the work of two people, Lisa Glant and Kelly Stewart. They've done a huge amount of work for two people, but it seems to me that we need to get more financial support, more real work happening in those associations, and also at our national institution, because if we look to
Thank you, everybody. So now looking at that from sort of the other side of things in our various roles as memory workers, archivists, records managers, which of our practices that we do are the most threatening in terms of ecological footprint? And following that, what can we start doing to adopt more sustainable practices, and how do we implement and advocate for these changes?
I'll go first, I guess. I would say we have the wrong footprint. Sometimes people focus on reducing the footprint. I think it's about increasing some footprints. A lot of the things that we kind of get stuck in thinking about is reducing everything we do because that's good environmentally. Well, there's also indirect effects from that. A road was built once through this one bush, and this one elder was very upset because it wrecked how she used the area. Well, 10 years later, the company wanted to deactivate the road and pull stuff out. Well, then that upset the elder because she then adjusted all of her practices around that road. So she wanted that footprint now to stay. And so I'm not advocating for more roads. That's not what I mean, of course. But it's understanding what our footprints are and how they might change, and allowing that to change with it. It's not all about all the time pulling back. It's about recognizing how things have changed and they can't go backwards. And then it's about protecting and maintaining that. So how we look at sustainability in footprints also has to account for these other stressors and change things that will change how we approach things. Like when you talk about implementing and changes in institutions, that's a little, I think what's really needed there is sometimes just education. And it's not just the individuals doing the work, it's the individual upstairs. Like everyone here has talked about the lack of people, right? And I can't even fathom what's happening in the States and in Puerto Rico. Like that's hurricane after hurricane. Like that's kind of the world we live in, right? Where it's not disaster preparedness. We live in a disaster and it's happening every day, and it just gets more concerning. So when we talk about reducing our footprint, it's about changing our footprints more, I think, and how we end up looking at it than reducing it. It's just changing them and directing them in a different way in order to find that path forward.
Just echoing that, I don't even think we're at a point in time right now to even think about how to reduce our ecological footprint, especially in the practice of archives. There's so much work that needs to be done beforehand before that can even be looked at. Like archivists are running short as it is.
I like the line, the changing. I love that because again, like Puerto Rico, it's very different where we're located to where institutions in the north are. And in terms of practices, there are many practices that we import to Puerto Rico. And for example, having a very cold temperature and controlling the humidity. We know that for institutions that have money, it's difficult to do that. So imagine how difficult it is for us that have no money at all. So this last year, we actually applied for a grant just to see how we can look back into different ways to treat our records. And what worries us is that we do have air conditioning. All of our deposits are controlled climate, of course. But what happens when a hurricane comes and you have 6 months with no electricity? All the work, all the energy, all the contamination that you threw in the environment for the past 10 years goes to waste, because what records don't like, or what cultural documents don't like, is the abrupt changes in the temperature and humidity. So they could have been very comfortable, but now I have a collection of negatives that shrunk in just a week, right? Because the environment changed so hard. So one thing that I would like to do, or try to move forward, is into changing those concepts of what is good for my collection and adapt them to what I can actually do to make that collection available for the next generations with the resources that I have right now and with the experience that we had with the hurricane specifically. And I think that's one of the most areas that we're going to be looking into, is how do we actually work with our environment that I know it's not going to keep up with the standards that they're using in the North, but there's got to be some research done if we actually want to prove that we can have our records in a different climate and they can still last as long as others, right? Because our climate does not change as much as in the North, where you have extreme weathers and of cold and in heat. In here, it's all standard. It's always hot and it's always humid.
Yeah, there's something that I think is worth unpacking, and I think we just heard a little bit about it, which is that there are also like massive hierarchies across cultural heritage institutions, right? And so one of the things that sometimes I encounter when I'm at spaces like Society of American Archivists or things like that is I sometimes hear a form of, I would say from, and I hear this more from people who work at prestigious institutions, I almost hear a form of cultural heritage exceptionalism, which is like, oh, well, we don't work in finance. We don't work in like a bad industry. And so therefore, whatever we do, whatever amount of electricity we consume or material consumption we use, that's okay because we do cultural heritage and it's good. And I'm so uncomfortable with that sort of mentality, especially coming from people who work at very prestigious institutions, because I think cultural heritage work and memory work at its best, and it often is not at its best, but at its best, I think it can be a model of regenerative and circular economies and reciprocity. And I really am uncomfortable when cultural heritage practitioners are just kind of a diluted form of that extractive mentality. So that's something that I often push back against, people who work at prestigious cultural heritage institutions that are relatively well resourced, which is that, just because we're doing good work does not absolve us of certain ethical responsibilities, and to hold ourselves, quite frankly, to a higher standard than more extractive industries do.
Hi, sorry I lost my connection there. It sometimes has been happening in my neighborhood quite a bit, and they're doing some work over on the corner, so I'm not sure if that's why, but I'm back. So, I just am thinking about this, and more, so much of it depends on your situation, where you're at, what you can do and what you need to do. So my philosophy is similar to Hilda's, that you first need to begin with assessing where you're at and what your most pressing needs are. And so I think that also it's not just about adaptation to climate change and mitigation of the effects of reducing our carbon footprint. As a sidebar, in my own research, I'm finding out some good things about IT, and that a lot of the concern we have about IT and about digitization and about digital storage, there's actually quite a bit of good news there in terms of what virtualization and what flash drives are doing in data centers in terms of reducing the footprint. So just as a side piece, I just wanted to bring that in, that there are some good things happening. But I think in addition to the the mitigation, the adaptation is thinking about resilience. And so that's also what we're talking about. This is all interthreaded through what you're talking about. And so it's the resilience of institutions that maybe could change their ways in many aspects. And it's about resilience of peoples and cultures. And it's thinking about, what needs to be maintained. So what needs to be maintained in terms of current identity and current activities and current things that are happening, and also what are the things that need to change and transform. And that may be differently apportioned. So I see that in terms of how we're looking at it as professional archivists working in often in institutions. And so it's hard for me to get at the meat of so many complex topics all together. But one piece of it, and I think that's why I was talking about the associations and the leadership of the federal archives, is that there's a need for those groups to take on some ownership and use the resources that they do have, which may be limited, and there may be many problems. We may need more. And again, I'm talking about the Canadian context. But there's a need for us to start sharing our knowledge in a different way. And I really feel that a lot of good work's been done in the associations, but that there's more that needs to be done. I also really think that on a personal level, if we're called to be archivists and librarians, we're maybe socially oriented, many of us. And so there is an element of what can we do. Some of it's paid work and a lot of it's unpaid work. And so there's a lot we can achieve. And I think in my own practice, that's one place where I really try to always have some component that's a community component that is unpaid work. And I call it work. It's not volunteering, it's work. And it's work that I might be paid to do in a regular job. But it's for an organization that can use some advice and some support to get to a point where they can have a more workable system. So I'm not sure if that makes sense, but that's a lot of what I do, because I think there's a thread here too, that it's difficult to talk about these topics. It can be overwhelming, and that was a component of the questions we received. So what do you do about it? How do you get up in the morning? How do you face climate anxiety, which I have a bad case of? And so I think, some of it is taking time out, and some of it is going to nature, and some of it is working for change. And I find that that's not always there's things that I do in the institution, but there's things that I need to do outside of the institution. And one last thing that I'd like to mention too, before I sort of leave this, is that there's a real need for us to collaborate more with people doing that emergency work. So we tend to think, well, so we're talking in our bubble of archives and libraries. And again, I'm talking about the Canadian context. And in our Canadian context, I don't see us reaching out that strongly to the EOC, emergency centers, the sustainability offices. And that is a resource that we need to engage with. So at the municipal level, there's many sustainability offices that know a lot about reducing, mitigating facilities and buildings. And So, you know, there's a need for us to collaborate with them at all as well. So, yeah, just kind of a bit of a number of things there together, but I just am a bit concerned about the normity that we sometimes, it leads to being overwhelmed. So then I kind of flip it and try and break it down and say, here are some components.
Thank you, everybody. While we think about our own impact instead of the impact on us, how can we best support communities who maintain their own histories through their own means? So, you know, for instance, the disproportionate effects of climate change on Indigenous, First Nations, Black, rural communities, as well as those who struggle with poverty, homelessness, and so on.
I I think I need to think about this one a little bit more, but the first thing that comes to mind is try not to inflict your own standards on the way they've kept their own archives. And I think that I see that quite often in archival work for Indigenous communities, is trying to shove this way of knowing into the archival box, so to speak. And I should mention that I've worked previously at the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation and closely with those archives, so I've seen that quite often.
Yeah, that you just touched on a very important point. You know, the correct was it the Library of Congress that sets out that little system that's used for the metadata. Yeah, that's a nice colonial way to look at information. It is anything but Indigenous, at least what I'm familiar with. How information is considered, thought, retrieved. They're like cognitive maps. They're sometimes spatially oriented, spiritually oriented, but they do not work like the Library of Congress. And if you, a way to assist is having, say at UBC. UBC has information from a lot of Indigenous peoples from all over the world. Well, perhaps looking at ways to have, say, a collection, but it's organized in a way that the community, the people, the culture thinks about information and how it retrieves information. If you want to store knowledge, and I find myself falling into, because of how I was taught, I fall into the same thing where someone asks me something, I won't bring something up because it's just not situationally based or something. And how communities think, and a lot of times it's spatial, but not all the time. But putting those mapping systems, cognitive maps in their head of how knowledge is, exists within culture, and trying to reflect that in that system. I don't have an answer to that, but that type of research and thinking to me kind of gets to where you're going, right? It's that it just doesn't work. It just doesn't. And there has to be a better way. This way of thinking exists. It's not like it's, you know, hypothetical. It's not a theoretical thing. It's there. How do we reflect that better in our systems?
Absolutely. I think you touched on a topic that I was thinking a little bit more about, and that's reciprocity. Often we don't see this reflected in Indigenous culture for archival records. And my biggest issue with archives is special collections and how we treat those special collections and who assigns ownership and how we're obtaining those types of things. When I think about those practices, I just cringe. And those types of things need to be changed. We need to set a new set of standards for Indigenous records, and those standards need to be created by Indigenous people and respected.
So I'm thinking too, like, again, about the situation dependent. And so I've been learning a lot in the past year. I've been working with the Inuvialuit settlement region and with the joint secretariat. And so what I've been learning a lot about is flexibility. Speaking to what the previous speakers were saying about not imposing this, you know, function-based classification, and so some flexibility about what we could bring to the table and how we can support, and what we can learn from the situation as well. So a couple of things I've really learned a lot about is flexibility being a big one. And another one is going slow. And another one is about being aware of what the systems that people have that are working for them, and learning from that. So learning what's already working. So it's kind of tricky because we're also working with digital systems. And my learning from the Inuvialuit TKL traditional local knowledge person is that she takes a very practical approach. So she has different transcripts and different materials, and she's trying to figure out how to make that system and the scientific system and the Western system overlap for the benefit of the research and the work they want to do. So how can I provide support for that work, and how can we do it in the digital system that we have, which is folders with names in usually English language, and so on. So it's a complex approach. I do think we can help bringing some of our skills, but it sort of starts with the context we're coming to. That's one piece that I've learned in the past year.
Two things that Rebecca said, oral history and having the people lead it. Those are two things I would suggest every archivist keep in mind when working with Indigenous people. Some of the information you might look at it. Like earlier I mentioned how the Canadian geography has official legal place names that are ethnic and sexual slurs. Well, there are some that actually are not, but to an outsider might look that way. But there's a history attached to it that is not derogatory, and it's only derogatory if looked at from an extreme liberal perspective by an outsider. We have a place, Chunamin Minge. Minge means lake. Chunamin, the old people couldn't say Chinaman, Chinese. Those terms, they couldn't say it. Choose water. And the only way they could say about the people that came in, Chunamin, because that's someone else said that in English. And so they said Chunaman. So this lake is called Chunaman Lake, or Chinaman Lake, if you were to translate it directly into English. So people see that as being racist and wrong. But that is actually an area that was called that because our ancestors, the Denizat, told the people, the Chinese people that came in, to hide from Munyas, from the white people. Go over there and hide. That area will provide for you. It was respect, and that place was named after the people. But to people looking at the records today, they think it's racist, and it actually, in that context, it isn't. Now, if say a certain group of people, these were non-Chinese people that thought it was racist. If people that say are Chinese and they're offended by it, well, then that's working with the community to address that. But as an outsider looking at stuff, you got to be very careful. There's history attached to that, and sometimes it's actually very important and respect that's in there. That's why we call it that. That links us to them. That's our connection to the land, and to those people and to that history of what happened in Canada. To us, that is extremely important, and it's all about respect. It's actually not about disrespect.
You definitely need the context of the narrative in Indigenous ways of knowing. I think I'd also like to offer that the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation is really working on the forefront of trying to change the perspective of how the archives are run with Indigenous people by guidance from survivors. So I think that that's really important and a real big change in how Indigenous people are reflected in archives, that it is literally trying to be guided by the people that they're collecting records on.
Yeah.
In a similar question, one that came up a lot whenever the students were talking about coming up with questions, is the issue of environmental racism and how it's continuously affected racialized communities, recent newcomers, and those with low incomes in staggeringly disproportionate ways to wealthier, whiter communities. You know, we see things like industrial land use, toxic dumps, pollution, pipelines, that communities have to contend with, that end up with air, water, and soil contamination, and brings about adverse health effects, the loss of traditional plant and animal food sources. So how can we use our positions as records professionals and memory workers to bring attention to and fight environmental racism? And it's a big question, but it is something that we were all hoping to at least get some kind of perspective on and start to grapple with as we all start to enter the field.
This is probably the first time I'll say this. This is where Canada could learn something from the US. We don't have environmental justice laws here. The US does. They've had since, I think, 1992 or something like that. We are nowhere close to being where the US is on recognizing it, analyzing it, and trying their best to fix it. For us to even come close to this, we're not even at the table. We're not in the field. We don't care. That's the Canadian way for this. I do really like the fact you guys use the term environmental racism. For one of the papers I published, a comment from a reviewer was, don't use that term. That upsets people. Just let the reader kind of think that. And I refused to change it, and so did the co-author that I was writing with. Because that's what it is. There's a geographer who wrote a very good paper on, it's not environmental racism, it's white supremacy. That's what we're talking about. White supremacy is not the Nazi running around or the Ku Klux Klan, like that type of stuff. It is ingrained in our institutions, sometimes in the individual as well, but those things exist. We need to treat causes, not the symptom. Like this is a disease in our society, and we need to treat the causes. How archivists can help, when you talk about gathering information or the collections, and I agree with Rebecca, I have trouble with that some days, as much as I like the idea too. But this is where putting collections together about areas, right? For Indigenous people, it's their territory, collecting all that information and making it available to them of all the things that have happened and maybe still be happening. So there's different ways I think you can have an approach to do that. But the first one ought to be is recognizing that archives themselves, I won't say all of them, I don't want to generalize, but in a lot of the cases, you're part of the problem. You have information that's not yours, or you display it in a way that's very culturally appropriate. One of our graves or burials, BC Museums has on their website, or it's BC or Canada, I can't remember which one it is now, and they're showing it. They have a picture of it. That's not right. They have, in the family, one of our families didn't know that their grandpa was interviewed back in 1970 something, and that transcript and even the audio is there. Well, why isn't that with us? Why did it happen me just playing on their site, looking for things, find this? So when you talk to me, there's a couple things. It's looking through collections and trying to get information back to the people, but then it's organizing the information they do have in a way that lends itself to looking at environmental racism, to looking at the injustices on the landscape. To me, there's those two elements where archivists can really, really make a big difference.
Absolutely. Hi. I think also looking at your archives from an intersectional lens is really, really important. Not taking face value to what is said or given to you, that a critical thought is absolutely imperative.
Yeah, I think I want to piggyback on this in terms of the at least the U.S. environmental law perspective on things. So I feel quite strongly that, you know, archivists have obligations to society, not just to the institutions that pay us for wage labor. And so, you know, archivists need to be involved in discourse around things like freedom of information laws or regulatory record keeping, right? Because a lot of the, you know, a lot of the environmental justice laws we do have require data gathering from industry or other entities around the impact of their activities on low-income communities or communities of color. And one of the things that we saw during the Trump presidency was a ton of deregulation saying, oh, actually, like, you don't have to report that kind of data anymore to the federal government. And so I really think that archivists need to be following, like, you know, freedom of information laws, deregulatory actions, things like that, because a lot of times when I try to follow it, I notice that like the people that are commenting most about things are environmental lawyers. And it's like, this has to do with record keeping. So where, you know, why aren't archivists like weighing in on things and filing public comments? And, you know, I was sort of thinking about this in terms of like, you know, what can archivists do with the local, you know, because wherever you live, you know, there's some kind of environmental injustice or environmental racism happening where you live, right? Like, you know, there is where I live in Ohio, there is, you know, in every state and every city. And so I always think, well, what are some of the particular skills that archivists have outside of our institutions? Because maybe, you know, some people work at institutions where there's not necessarily a focus on environmental materials, but like, what are those sort of skills that we can bring into a, you know, community or activist space? Obviously, we don't want to be, you know, I am the archivist, I am here to help you, but, you know, with humility and if we are welcomed, right? And so an example I use from my own experience is that the river, the major watershed where I live is anchored by the Ohio River. And so the Ohio River feeds eventually into the Mississippi River. It's where I get my drinking water from. It's also really heavily industrialized, and it is in many ways a lot of the industry that is sort of in the Mississippi Delta, which many people know as like Cancer Alley. A lot of that is relocating to the, you know, headwaters of the Ohio River because that is fracking central. And so this is where, like, you know, fracking is sort of like the new oil, right? And it is cheap energy. And according to all the studies, it's going to last us 100 years, right? And so there are all of these companies that are relocating massive fracking operations up, you know, a few hundred miles north of where I live. And so there's an agency that is headquartered in the city where I live called the Ohio River Sanitation Commission. And one of their obligations is to actually set pollution control standards for the Ohio River. So basically saying, like, here is how much industry is allowed to discharge into the river. Here's how much they are legally allowed to pollute before it becomes a problem. And this was a few years ago, so it was during the Trump administration. They were saying, you know what, like the Environmental Protection Agency, which is a federal agency, they issue standards, so we don't need to issue any standards either because EPA has got it, right? Which is a very scary proposition during the Trump administration. And so a lot of us were saying, I don't know why we think we can trust the EPA right now. You guys still need to do your job. And so one of the things that I did, because I'm an archivist and I want to know the institutional history of things, is I went up to the state library, which is in a city about 2 hours north of where I live. And I pulled all of the annual reports from this agency when they were started in the 40s. And I took copies of all of those reports to a public hearing. And because it was a public hearing where they were required by law to like create essentially transcripts of the hearing and all of the public comments. And I just read like tons of pages from, this is what you guys were founded to do in the 1940s. This was your original founding mission. And now you're just walking away from it. And it's so transparent because like so many of the people on this had connections to corporations, right? So it's very clear why they were doing this. And that made an impact, right? Because it was just sort of like, you know, I view this role as sort of mitigation against gaslighting, right? Because that's what environmental justice is. It is a form of gaslighting. It is a form of saying like, you know, oh, of course this is just located where it is, right? Like that just coincidence, right? It's just coincidence that there's more pollution or more asthma or more forms of cancer in communities of color or poor communities. And so I think if archivists can just sort of use those skills to say, no, here's all the data, right? Here's all the records, here's all the information, file freedom of information requests, and then show up and be like, here is, you know, the documentation we have that you are gaslighting these communities into forms of like, you know, just pretending this is okay. So yeah, that's I think one of the most important things that archivists can do.
Jack of all trades, master of none is what I think of archivists.
So the next few questions on our list that we sent out, I feel like can kind of be combined because you've already touched on some of them. But, you know, we've been looking, when we look at some of the technological advances that are discussed as abilities to combat climate change, you know, how do we avoid some of the known pitfalls of technology and AI, like data privacy, biased algorithms, carbon footprints, you know, and like what is our responsibility in the archives to support environmental justice and make sure that not only is our practice of like combating racism and injustice, but also the technologies we use and the frameworks that we're using. Like we can't, if we're, you know, not to master's tools it, but, you know, if the tools we're using to combat environmental racism and climate change are inherently biased, how do we start working on that?
A lot of your questions revolved around this same type of issue, right? This technology. And to me, there are to figure out solutions. It's first looking at that problem, right? Even though like earlier in the panel, I talked about how we're using 3 different systems to help with what we're going to do, but at the same time, I see technology as one of the main threats. Many of them have like a dehumanizing effect on cultural knowledge. There are a lot of funding programs and initiatives that focus on digitizing and documenting cultural knowledge, but they remove people from the land, adults and kids. They become accustomed to technology. They turn to a book or an app before to the elder or to the land. Kids, when they're at camp, the elders always say they're doing this all the time, right? So instead of seeing the repository sitting in front of them and engaging with all of that, they're stuck on their technology. The second issue is and I spoke a little bit about this, is that information systems, like on the surface, they're passive contributors to colonialism. And people don't recognize that. That's what they are doing. If you keep using that system, you're doing nothing but perpetuating colonial issues that we have. And they're pervasive and quite aggressive because of that. It decontextualizes our traditional knowledge. Now, every system will to some extent, but it's how do we address those things? So when I'm dealing with technology, that's kind of what I'm stuck with, is how do I address I don't want people to use it, but yet I want people to use it. And how do I store information that I don't think can be stored right? That's where I'm stuck. I can't even get to the other things like access and ethics and things like that. We have traditional ways we do things, right? We have our protocols. You can look at it from a research ethics perspective and how you engage and how you store information. And there's a lot of similarities culturally. We don't sign consent forms. Why? Because by the time you get to the interviewee, you are going through all of these rules. You should not have done you shouldn't even be sitting there if you haven't done everything properly, and that you're not going to do it afterwards. That relationship for information doesn't stop and end. It's a continuous thing. And even when that person has passed, that knowledge is still there. The people are still there, and those relationships are still there. Technology can't or should never replace those traditional ways of thinking and working. How we do that, that's a lot more difficult in operationalizing those practices. But anything we do, that's what we're trying to do.
Very well said, Bruce. I think like just in the most basic sense, digitization of records can't be the future. And the next row of archivists that come out aren't really going to have to think about how to maintain records in a digital sense that maintains people's humanity. And but there's no easy answer to that.
I guess we also have to take into consideration that those projects for digitization and digital humanities, sometimes they focus and they serve the big institution, the people that have the money, and they're using the resources of the people that have none. So a problem with digital humanities is that you win a grant, you go and digitize records from a small community, and then you don't give the community the resources to even access their records. So you did a job, but the community will never benefit from it because maybe you didn't consider that they don't have access either to internet or a good connection to internet to view these beautiful images, that are on the web. And in the end, the only institution that is benefiting is the one that pay for it. And they use the people that didn't have the resources for their own benefit.
Well said, Hilda. I'm just looking at your post behind you. Eira is your name. History repeating itself. And in history, we have seen people that had access to write the history of the world and leave out the narrative of Indigenous people or marginalized people. And history is literally on the precipice of repeating itself through digitization.
Yeah, the sign up here says archivists against history repeating itself for anyone who's having trouble seeing it. And I think some of the other panelists have already talked about the very colonialist tendencies of archives. And I just want to dwell on this for a second, and particularly to the continental United States, which is that record keeping is fundamentally intertwined with colonialist extraction, straight up. And so if we think about the continental United States, the colonial enterprise of taking land from indigenous peoples and then using enslaved labor to create wealth was all backed up by systems of record keeping. So, you would have land surveys that would say, okay, this is a map of the land, right? And then you would have agencies like the General Land Office that would issue titles. So actual pieces of paper that say, this white settler now owns this land. You would have purchase records for enslaved people who were then forced to convert these dispossessed lands into like white supremacist wealth, right? And meanwhile, at the same time, in the antebellum period, you had free people of color who were having to they were literally carrying papers on them that said, I am a free person, right? And so the entire sort of, history of record keeping in the United States is so intrinsically entwined into colonialism and racialized capitalism that I think that is something that the history of US archivists really have not reckoned with. I don't think, not to the degree that we need to. And arguably there's still a lot of this happening today, right? Documentation around undocumented people, right? Or the fact that thinking about, how white supremacist culture objectifies what we call natural resources. And so we are still issuing things like leases for offshore drilling, right? That's sort of record keeping that legitimizes this idea that we can destroy the earth and do it legally and make someone money at the same time. So whenever I think about this, I think this is so hard because archivists, especially archivists trained in sort of Western methods, think, okay, like documentation is a good thing, right? That's sort of a theme that we have internalized so deeply we can't really unsee it. And yet all of these forms of record keeping serve to legitimize these really, really harmful legacies that are going to take generations to untangle.
And there's where we run into a problem with historians, because they love your records. And then they say, this is what happened, and this is the truth of the treaty. And we're like, no, that's not what happened. That's what somebody a couple hundred kilometers away said. That's not what happened. But all of a sudden, these records become truth. But at the same time, I'm not saying get rid of them. I definitely don't mean that. But it's putting them in the proper light and understanding that context. That's something, the discipline needs to figure out how to do. Don't just put them as this unbenign thing. Actually, they're mistelling the truth, and perhaps in a detrimental way for the people today.
So for our last half hour, I think we should transfer to some audience questions. And I think that works because one of our ones that had been submitted through Twitter by Joy Rowe of ARMA Vancouver chapter is also one that very similar to one we had on our prepared list. Joy's question was, so many people are burnt out during the pandemic, especially people who are already living through collective traumas. How did you marshal the resources to prepare your talk and offer insights and experiences? Specifically today, what motivated you to come to this panel when you could have just stayed in bed? And then our question was, as Lois had mentioned, a lot of us come into this socially minded, and a lot of what we do is unpaid. And it's sort of, we talk about how a lot of archival and library work is considered like a feminine caretaker type of job. And so when things are feminized, they're devalued and unpaid. And I think, how do we not get overwhelmed by despair whenever we engage in work like this?
I would like to comment that archivists are so awesome. You guys have the ability to be, like when I said master of none, jack of all trades, it really means that you have taken an intersectional lens on different subject areas, different faculties, different knowledge systems, and really tried to hone that into your craft. I think you should be proud of that work that you're doing, and that more and more so, you have an opportunity to change systems and write history in the right way. So I think just honing in on the fact that the time that you have here is the time that you're doing something good, and that's really important. I think, like I said, archivists are awesome. I think if I was in any other line of work, it would be archival.
Thank you, Natalie, for when you said the feminist perspective of how people see the position or the jobs as being feminine and the underpaying and that issue. I not until you said that did I think that, because in my world, that's not the view of knowledge holders, right? It's at all. Knowledge holders are not feminine. They're everybody. Well, I shouldn't say everybody. It crosses genders. So that was a completely foreign, when you said that, it kind of blew my mind for a second, because I'm like, that's not how we look at our elders. Like, they're male, they're female, they're two-spirited people. Like, we don't see it that way. But in the non-Indigenous setting, I can definitely see that, of course, and that's really sad. Very sad when you think about it. So I have to think about that some more. I'll answer the other question of the person who put it in, how I prepared. This is something I learned from my friend and colleague. We do little ceremonies. We do ceremonies quite a bit. And my dad once said to me, he's like, oh, don't get caught up. We're not TV Indians, right? He hates that show, The Dancing of Wolves, for that reason, right? Is people see this thing and they think ceremonies is thing that doesn't really exist, if at all. And so every day I try to remember, but there's ceremony that I go through and to start my day. And I learned that from my friend who's like, Bruce, why are you saving it? It's not meant, you know that. That's not what you're taught. And for some weird reason, it was stuck in my head because of the influences I get from outside. And then she brought me back and grounded me. And this was about 4 or 5 months ago, probably. That's how I prepared, is listening to other people and coming back to key things that help us be grounded, be healthy, and start the day and end the day too with a clear mind and health.
I think of the questions in the list, I think this was the hardest for me, because despair is normal for me. So I live in a constant despair. Like, I don't wake up a day where I don't feel the weight of the world falling. It's how I said at the beginning, I don't know if it's just us, but I believe that we live in a crisis, like a crisis after another after another. So for me, I was talking with a friend yesterday, just, to prepare. And in a joke, it was like, well, yeah, that's very simple. You just have a lot of margaritas. That's what you do. If you want to get over it, you go through a lot of margaritas. But it's not how not to live with despair, is how to get over it and work around it, so your world doesn't just fall down. Because exactly like the person in Twitter, is like, you don't want to wake up, you don't want to get out of bed. Like, things seem so horrible outside that there is nothing really inspiring for you to actually go and do your work. But for us, is the contrary, because we live in that state of a constant questioning, of not knowing what's going to happen, of not knowing if another disaster is going to strike, if we're not going to have power, or like, there's so many things happening, that for us is a normal. And I know it shouldn't be like, it's it shouldn't be normal to be feeling like this. But for us, it's like, okay, so how do I get out of it? Well, like Bruce mentioned, you know, I try to focus on one thing, you know, and what can I do today better, maybe that I did the day before? Like, how do I get one project finished? And those little steps that we take that actually seem that they have a meaning are the ones that keep us moving forward. But I think this was the hardest question of all.
I found it good to be back at it as a student at my age. It's sort of like being a next generation student. So I've learned a lot from the students that I've first, you know, a few years ago, I was back in class, and then now I'm an instructor. So I've learned a lot from the students, and I've learned a lot from, I remembered things. Like I remember now that I don't need that much money. So that's not maybe what we want to hear, but I've remembered that, like it's only a small part of things. And so it made me more able, like I've always sort of volunteered, but now I have a different view about that. I have a view about that's really just part of my work. It's not really about whether or not it's paid. I have to make my living and I have to take care of my obligations, but I think living a less consumeristic lifestyle and focusing on what matters, and yeah, just participating in the good things as well. There's a lot of tough things that happen, but there's, as Hilda said, there's some successes. There's small projects that I may have worked on, you know, even 10 years ago that I still think back to. And, you know, like in when Eira was talking about the pollution project she worked on, I worked on a stream with some stream keepers on bringing back a creek. And we went into the archives and we found everything we could find on that creek. And we found a picture of the foreshore as it was before really that area was settled. And so this was a goal of the stream keepers to bring back that habitat. So I think that we could go a lot deeper into our records. We could give up on this idea of being objective and impartial. Maybe we need to be more subjective. Maybe we need to be more connected to the things that matter and the ways that we could contribute. And I think, yeah, and really come to grips with new ways of doing things. I mean, it's really difficult. The naming piece is really something I've been working on and thinking about a lot, because there's all these settler names. There's other layers of names. There's names that we don't have a right to use or maybe understand, but they're really critical in activating these records. So I think a lot of it is about activating the records. It's about caring for them and making them last and preserving them, but it's also, to me, about identifying them and activating them. And I can't always do that in the institutions I work for. So that way, I think it's a real gift to work with other groups in doing that work. So yeah, sorry, I don't like speaking in public, even though I've done all this teaching, so I get very shaky on that. So, but yeah, I think that there's a lot that we are doing, and always every day learning more is a big part of it.
I get asked a version of this question a lot because, you know, I do so much work around how climate change impacts archives, and I always have sort of two things that I answer, some of which has already been touched on, which is that you know, climate change is very much this, it's very much a narrative of death and decline. And so I feel that it is really imperative to bear witness to life. Like life is still being formed, life is still being born all the time. And that's, I think, really important for us to witness, right? So whenever I'm sort of getting overwhelmed, I'm like, oh, this is my signal that I need to go spend time outside. I need to go walk in a forest and see like a tree sapling being born, right? Because life is still continuing. And I also think it's really, you know, I don't know if this is particular to the American Midwest where I grew up, or sort of my upbringing, or white people in general. I don't know, but I think for me, learning how to not be afraid of my grief and rage has been really important, and I think transformative internal work that I will probably be engaged with until I leave this current plane of existence. You know, I have taken workshops on climate grief, and those have been really powerful. And I try to always remind myself, like, we grieve because we love, right? And we get angry because we seek justice. And if we don't have, you know, movements or work that is centered in love and justice, then it's like, what are we doing? So, you know, there's a lot of work out there by people like Joanna Macy, who's written a lot about climate grief. And so, you know, if people are struggling with that, I highly recommend that they look into that. You know, personally for me, like, religious practice has been a really transformative experience, just because it does sort of hold that space for my grief and moving through it, and not getting paralyzed by that. And I think that there are a lot of people who can be dismissive of that because they understandably have a lot of spiritual trauma in their backgrounds. But I really, I think to be in this kind of work for the long haul, you have to really find ways to sort of align yourself with those values you want to see in the world. And I just want to end this line of thinking with a tweet I saw the other day that actually made me laugh, because at first I was like, oh, that's a joke, and then I thought, oh, that's legit. I feel this. And the tweet was, getting enough sleep is a climate change leadership strategy. And I really feel that, because I personally deal with sort of like 3 a.m. wake ups where I'm like panicking about the state of the world, but I'm still half asleep. And so yeah, getting enough sleep is a climate change leadership strategy. I totally endorse it.
Yes, I didn't really answer that first question. Hey, I felt like there was like 4 or 5 questions rolled into that one thing. I learned from my elders that this world that we live in and this life that we are given is a gift. And when you frame your mind as this life is a gift, you start to work through the world a little bit differently and see things a little bit differently. I think in terms of environment and land protection and water protection, I can't save everything, and I can't be everything and do everything. I need to honor the gift that Creator gave me, and that's this life I have and the children that I have. And that's kind of how I've always, not always, starting to learn that. And I think that that's really important, is to give yourself room to understand that we learn these things in phases of our life, and that it's not something that just comes naturally to understand. For this meeting, I actually brought out some water. When we talk about the land, or we talk about our relatives, we're always making sure that they're here with us when we're talking about them, so that we draw energy and strength from that. So that's kind of where I was taught that. And I know that working at the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation was really, really draining in terms of residential school survivor stories and working in that field of work. And it was really important to make sure that I understood my life was a gift and honor that. And that's the only way we can move through the world, is to honor that and honor the work that you're currently doing in whatever respect that is.
Thank you all for being so open and willing to share personal anecdotes and stories to answer that question. I know we ask the question, but one thing that we do sometimes have space to talk about in class is just like finding our communities. And I think it's really, you know, we talk about a lot of things in archives that we're doing wrong. But I think when we're in class, I look around and everybody in the class seems to be on the same page as far as getting better and being better and doing better and finding out how our practice affects all kinds of people and not just the institutions we work for. And I think having a space now, knowing that a bunch of people that are about to graduate all take this as an implicit understanding of archives rather than something that we're going to have to learn or needs to be taught to us, I think has been pretty hopeful. So there are some questions in the Q&A, and the first one I believe came through when you were talking earlier, Hilda, and it says, how can cultural heritage institutions then reduce their carbon footprint while making sure that their records are kept in controlled environment?
I guess a lot of research needs to be done, and we should review our practices. If we want to change and move forward and try to do something different, research needs to be done. Because up to now, in terms of what I was speaking, is the control temperature and humidity, but also it's the level of how that temperature and humidity has to be. So 50-30 in a tropical island is very, 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 very hard. Especially because I have a building that is from the 1840s. So my building breathes every day. So it's very hard for me to maintain a controlled temperature. So I know that I am spending energy in a very worthy way, because I'm not doing the job that I'm trying to reach a level that I can't really do it. So what kind of research I can do to prove that I can do other practices and still take care of my records, so for the next generations to have access to them.
Okay, thank you. The next question came in when we were talking about technology. It says, a lot of conversation around climate change is driven by social media these days. It includes both scientific data as well as mis- and disinformation on climate change. Is it important for archivists to capture such discourse? If yes, how can we capture these conversations?
Sometimes it's not as easy as people think is to capture that. We dealt with an issue up north where we were dealing with environmental, well, actually it wasn't environmental racism, it was just racism. Simple racism. I don't know how that would have been captured by archivists without people collecting it themselves and then giving it to an archivist or to a center or something like that. So to me, it's not just on the archivist. That's a broader social question for people and archivists to engage with the public on saying, hey, these are the topics we're interested in documenting for the future, and asking people to donate materials. So to me, it's kind of a two-way street there, where it's not just the archivist, because there's going to be so much that happens. I'm not on Facebook, never have been, never want to be. What I understand Facebook, how it works is you can have friends and you can like shut people off. So there's a lot of private things that occur, or things that occur, like archivists can't monitor Facebook, I guess is what I'm getting at. So to answer that question, to me, it's the individuals and the archives kind of working together on things that matter.
I would just throw out that, so was it 2 or 3 years ago at the RBMS conference in Baltimore, which is Rare Books and Manuscripts, one of the speakers was a journalist who I'm afraid I can't remember her name right now, but she helped break the ExxonNew story, which was all of the data that turned out that ExxonMobil, or what is now ExxonMobil, they had done all this research in the 80s in their internal research labs to find out like, oh, climate change is gonna happen. And so they knew that like back in the 80s, right? And so the reason that they got those records, because you can't FOIA Exxon, like they're a private company, right? She got all those records from like someone who had inside connections to the company that tipped her off and sent her all the documents. And there's similar stories, of course, with like, you know, what we know, what we found out about big tobacco in the 90s. And it turns out, you know, they use the same playbook. And so I think there's sort of levels of disinformation we need to think about. There's like people's, you know, cranky relatives like sharing dumb stuff on Facebook, right? And that's a form of disinformation. But then there's like Exxon, you know, putting out press releases saying like, oh, climate change isn't that bad. Well, their own data had that. And so you know, I mean, if we can't abolish capitalism, which we like probably need to in order to survive, you know, into planetary existence and keep going. So if we can't do that, like I'm just like, we need to like have some kind of record keeping laws that apply to companies, right? If companies are public companies that are being like traded by stockholders, like they have to have documentation. And actually this has been a huge lawsuit in the state of New York, which is like, did ExxonMobil basically defraud their investors, right? And so I think that's really an area that like archivists should be thinking about, which is, okay, like ExxonMobil is not gonna like, you know, donate their records to the archives, but are there laws we can call for that force these companies that are engaged in disinformation to basically be forced into disclosing things that they have tried for generations to cover up?
Yeah, one good example right now is there's been stories lately on how the banks, the Canadian banks, are among the top funders of oil. And so of the top 20 banks funding oil, 5 of them are Canadian. And it's really interesting because last week I was walking downtown and there was a pipeline mini 10-person protest outside of the main bank headquarters of TD. So I stopped for a while, and so, you know, this whole piece around the shareholders, the companies supporting, drawing attention to that is starting to work, and we should do more of it. So that can be something we do as private citizens. That is something we can support by where we have or know about records. Because, you know, it's really starting to happen in Alberta, the tar sands. You know, the first thing the Biden administration, first day of the administration, they canceled the pipeline, they canceled Keystone Pipeline, which is huge. And McKenney, which is the Alberta Premier, is now starting to talk to about renewable energy, which he has been dead against for decades because he sees his own future at risk because of the cancellation of the pipeline. So, I mean, there are things happening right now that we can get behind and we can support as citizens. But, you know, we could think about how do the records we know about, or how do the information we have, how can that support, you know, that story? Yeah, it's pretty, I find it exciting right now. I think that, and also, you know, yesterday, the Supreme Court of Canada supported the carbon tax, which is also really a big deal. So there's some big things happening right now that we can get behind.
I think it's important to know too that you're watching for outcomes from social media, and I think that part is important. I don't think that you can, like Bruce said, monitor Facebook, but I think you can monitor the outcomes. There's a lot of people that talk about Manitoba Hydro, and I think that hydro in general allots money to research and doesn't readily share all of that research or those findings with people. So there should be some discourse to that, right? But I think as archivists, being jack of all trades again, is watching for those social outcomes and monitoring them properly, and you know, giving light to that. For example, the story you talked about with the river, how Dakota Access Pipeline and the Water is Life fight against that. Those things should be captured. That it took Indigenous people to fight against that for it to be public news. And there are still many fights going around that are not public.
I struggle with the term disinformation some days about what that actually means. And I'll play devil's advocate a little bit. Renewable energy companies are a source of the disinformation sometimes. I remember early on, wind farm companies used to love to brag about what they're doing and how non-renewables, they're not good and how they're so much better. There's not one single wind farm we've built in this province that stopped one single well site, mine, or something else. If anything, it's made things worse because wind farms love really nice, smooth, not too windy roads. Well, guess who else likes that? Forestry companies, oil and gas companies, mining companies. So whenever these other developments are occurring, we're not stopping other things. In many cases, we're actually helping those other developments. But yet the renewable energy industry prides itself on being so much better. Well, come on, guys. They're contributing to some of the problem. First off, you need coal to make a wind farm. You're not making a wind farm out of just nothing. So that disinformation is, how do we categorize that? How do we understand what that is? Because sometimes it's people playing with terms and things, right? It's just that political spin. We saw that with some UBC professors did a really, really important study in the Northeast that demonstrated these coal companies were actually not, or coal mines were actually not paying any taxes or actually getting tax refunds. So instead of giving the people $200 million, which their environmental assessment said they would, they actually got money back. They didn't pay anything. They actually got a tax refund in 1 year. Whenever that study came out, the other mining association talked about how good they are for caribou and all the stuff they've done. So how do we, when you talk about that disinformation and how do we organize that, I don't have a clue how in the world an archivist would do that. Because to me, it's so complicated, those issues like that, how you put that endpoint, that output at the end. I don't know. We struggle with how we organize it internally, let alone trying to figure out what part of it's disinformation, what part of it isn't internally.
And also we can really collaborate with the librarians because they tend to have a lot more resources in terms of messaging, communication, and this is an area of interest that I think we could probably learn a lot from them. So when we're being really strong about our stance about archivists and just being archivists, a lot of people are duals, I know that. So that might be something we could learn some more about. But also to your point, Bruce, I'm also always thinking about biofuel right now as well. So I don't know, it's a scary, energy is a huge, huge thing.
Well, as you mentioned, the carbon tax, especially since that's rolled out in Canada, I feel like hiring the carbon tax is kind of like a waving my hand while I'm doing something over here. And that's something we all need to be aware of. And I think that that goes back to that intersectionality and critical thinking, is understanding that what's being presented in media, what's being presented in social media needs to really be critically evaluated before making a solid decision on those kinds of things. The carbon tax increase, is that being increased in the oil sands?
Yeah, and also it's scary in the way that maybe it seems that in Canada they're doing something good, but maybe that company is going to move to another place where they don't have these taxes, and then we see the environmental racism because, you know, they will go and do the damage into a different place and do the service in Canada, and Canada, you know, they won't realize.
You touched on a good point, right? There's Canadian companies that do that. So we allow them to exist in Canada, to profit in Canada, and then go around the world and do that. We don't hold the company accountable here just because their practices are over there. So you touched on a very big problem that and it's not that it's unknown, it's just government doesn't want to address it.
Yeah, in here, and it might be a very sad story to end, but in here in Puerto Rico, we had an issue with contamination with military residuals, because Puerto Rico has 2 islands that were space where the government and the military of the United States will do their practice. So this population is a population that has the biggest rate in cancer in Puerto Rico, and different sickness like allergies or asthma, and they're all related to that military dust and the industrial residuals that still live in the island, and they're the military of the United States, and you cannot get them accountable. They cannot come and clean. We still have bombs inside the ocean, which is beautiful. And how can we make that accountable so they can take the stuff out and make better the islands that they destroyed?
I think some of what you've touched on and this answer is actually a good plug for our next panel on documenting injustice as it unfolds. We do have Yvonne Ng coming, who works at Witness, which does a lot of work educating people on how to document injustice. Vern Harris will be there, who works for the Nelson Mandela Foundation and was the state archivist following apartheid in South Africa. And also Gabriel Salas, who works with the Texas After Violence Project and documenting oral histories with people who have been affected by state-sanctioned violence. So I think hopefully we can get into some of those questions there as well about how we do tackle things like social media and how we do inform the public about how they can best start documenting things. I do know that it is after 2 hours. So I understand if anyone has to leave, but there is one more question that we had sent to you beforehand that was an audience question that I feel like is a very important one about land back. And if you guys are willing to stick around and talk about it. But yes, I understand if you have to leave, but I will read off this question from Joy of Arma again. And it's a long one. So it says, what if the answer to all of this is land back? How would this framework change how we talk about archives, archivists, and climate change? She used context from a Twitter thread from a podcaster of Medicine for the Resistance that says, Patty Krawick wrote a recent thread that started, land back isn't that hard. Only 11% of land in Canada is privately owned. 41% is federal, 48% is provincial. So 89% of the land claimed by Canada could be restored with no impact to you. So her question was, can we just have a conversation on the panel where everyone assumes that we are all working earnestly on land back, and that we are no longer afraid of changing governments, changing land ownership systems, changing who taxes who? If we're already living in that world, what conversations would we be able to have?
First, I'll just note, those numbers aren't quite accurate. While 11%, that's not incorrect. Well, I'm assuming it's not. I don't actually know whether it's 11 or 12 or 13, but there's a difference between private land and all of the tenures on the landscape. I just got asked a similar question about 2 weeks ago in the community. The entire treaty area, our land, is taken up in a way. Right? You have Canada that makes a claim, the province of British Columbia that makes a claim. Then we have guide outfitter tenures, trap line tenures for non-Indigenous people. Then we have oil and gas, mining, forestry, wind energy, hydroelectric dams. All of those, you're talking about things that are like deep in different types of land tenures. All of those give rights to different entities and people. So that question is, it is actually hard. It's not quite that simple because the government has already given out all of these rights to other entities. And the way our law works, if the government wants to take them back, which Alberta, I think, figured out quite quickly when they said they're going to make a bunch of parks, and the oil and gas and the tar sands said, well, that's fine. You can have the land back. Just give me my $10 billion or $100 billion that I would make, and then you can have it. So there's a huge problem because of that. Some territories might be okay. Ours is just like a massive problem. Or say where UBC is. How do you give something back when in that one area, the territories there, it's almost all gone completely, right? So that it's not 11%. We're talking about maybe it's like 0.05 that's left. So those numbers aren't an accurate portrayal of the situation or the problems that would be to achieve this. I'm not saying it couldn't be achieved over a very long term, but it's not something that could happen in decades just because of what the current situation is. And companies aren't just going to give things back. They've invested millions and millions of dollars, and they're responsible legally to their shareholders. Well, those shareholders is the public too, a lot of times, right? So it's a tangled web that's an oversimplification of a very complex problem. Not that I'm disagreeing with the idea. It's just not as simple as it's been kind of set out here.
I just want to note that, not in context of anything Bruce has said, that land back isn't just for Indigenous people, it's for all people. That fighting for the land and the environment is fighting for all people, not just Indigenous.
I mean, there is some work we can do with our current practice. So, you know, just even talking about our appraisal function or archival functions, like description and naming, and you know, we can do different forms of visualization. So, you know, we have this technology. I don't know if it's good or bad, but the history pin and those types of spatial presentation of knowledge. So, I mean, I feel like there's some, we don't even have to talk about, well, what would it look like after this happened? We could talk about what can we do right now and what does that look like? And like how can we find a forum so that we can do this collaboratively, so that we can have a less, a more open approach to how we present our knowledge. And by our knowledge, it's all of our knowledge. And does it have to come from the institutions? Can it come from the communities? Can we start finding ways to collaborate and share and work together? And can we do that now? And can we make a difference to what's happening now? Can we work for good now? And I think it's really interesting. I sometimes look at these observatories. So, you know, they have in England, they have the mass observation of archives, and they have some very good observatories of climate in Central and South America, where people contribute knowledge, and it's more a citizen science, kind of citizen involvement approach. And I think these, I feel, are really exciting places that we could explore. But we need some leadership there. We need to figure out what that, and there is some work that's been done. Like there was, when we first got History Pin, people started new types of projects. And it just seems to me like I work, you know, in municipalities, we work a lot with the geographical information systems, and there's lots of layers on maps. And it just seems like we could have a lot more layers, and that we could have a lot more people contributing, and that we could collaborate better. But where would we do that, and how would we get that started? I'm not so sure. I'm interested. I think about it quite a bit.
All right. With that, I know we're already over. So unless any of you have anything you want to add, I think we can wrap up. And just thank you all so much for being a part of this during, very strange times and conversations that are not always easy and straightforward. Um, everybody has, we have time and we have knowledge, and we understand that those aren't, endless, bountiful, just waiting for people. It takes a lot of effort to share those sometimes. And we do really appreciate you all being here and being willing to share that with us. So thank you, everybody. Thank you again to the ACA, the students that have helped organize, and to everybody that showed up.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Hilda
you.
Teresa,
Thank
thank
you for
you.
having us.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thanks for the invitation. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Okay, and have a good day, everyone.
Bye, Brian. Thanks.
No worries. I hope everybody saw the feedback form. I posted it twice, but wow. Okay.
Yeah, I forgot to mention it, but I was thinking